Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first session of Ether, Field, Manifold, Transcendental Aesthetic. From Descartes to Feynman via Faraday and Einstein, the notion of some abstract spatiotemporal domain in which matter and its motions interact has posited as the fundamental ground of physical theory. As Kant demonstrated in the Transcendental Aesthetic of the Critique of Pure Reason, such a formal geometric ground is one of the necessary a priori conditions for the possibility of experience. The pure forms of intuition, space and time, are what render the manifold of sensation receptive to order. They provide the understanding with the structured data it requires to synthesize appearances spatiotemporally. Without these forms, sensations would not be arrayed in any configuration of simultaneity or succession. Experience would be rhapsodic, lacking all coherence and unity. Kant's aesthetic, however, is developed within a Newtonian framework. Space is the a priori form of outer intuition, homogeneous and essentially Euclidean. Time is a pure form of inner intuition, continuous and one-dimensional. Yet even within this Newtonian framing, Kant, as per the metaphysical foundation of the natural sciences, still maintains the notion, still widespread in the 18th century natural philosophy, of the ether, a dynamic plenum of matter underlying all intersections. Though Kant carefully avoids positing a physical ether as a constituent of things in themselves, the concept nonetheless lingers as a heuristic constraint. Forces require a domain of possible transmission, and the understanding requires an organized manifold to operate upon. However, the emergence of the field in the works of Faraday and Maxwell, the relativistic reconceptualization of the space-time manifolds in Einstein, and the development of quantum field theory in the 20th century collectively displays the Newtonian framework that silently underwrites Kant's aesthetic. What once appeared as fixed, absolute forms of intuition have become plastic and relativistic. The manifold of space-time is no longer understood as an empty formal container, what Leibniz and Kant called absolute space and time, but a medium whose very geometry depends upon energetic and material configurations. Indeed, matter and energy bend the very fabric of space-time, and the geometry of this interactive manifold dictate what it is possible to intuit. The speed of light sets an absolute limit to the informational, intuitable horizon. Furthermore, in quantum field theory, even the notion of particles as objects in space and time gives way to excitations of underlying fields defined over highly abstract manifolds. That is to say, no longer can we separate those objects of experience from the field in which they say to be experienced. Matter is not placed in a field. The field is matter.
Thank you.
Now, about the instructor. Joe White is a researcher affiliate of the Research Network for Philosophy of Technology and executive editor of Technophany, the network's academic journal, Randbound University Press. His research is situated in the emerging transdisciplinary field of continental philosophy of media, science and technology, currently focusing on how 19th century thermodynamics was received into philosophy and literature, and how scientific concepts, including energy, entropy, and information, have become philosophical concepts. He has published articles and books chapters related to this research, including on the notions of signification, energy, and education in educational philosophy and theory. So, Joe, please take it away.
Thank you very much. What was your name? Sorry, because you just said New Center for Research Practice.
Oh, Vera.
Vera, thank you very much, Vera. That's just to say thank you to your name, not just to the New Center for Research Practice. Thank you very much. I need to update that bio. It's about 7 years old now, but that's fine. Not much has changed. Well, things have changed, but that's okay. Okay, good. And I was also, when listening through, also seeing whether I was still agreed with what I wrote about when I wrote that description. It's always a good thing to hear that through. And yeah, I still agree with lots of it. Okay, so I'm not too sure if anyone, I know I can see Neve here from my last, hi Neve, from, and Arnab as well. And I think, I'm not sure if Pradeep was also, it's probably some people who are here from my previous seminars and lots of people that don't know me as well. So hello everyone. Um, as I was just saying, just to kind of to repeat what I was saying a little bit earlier, um, I am going to kind of go straight into, well, I'll kind of get a little bit of background to the work. What then I'll be saying, I'll speak for probably about maybe 45 minutes to an hour, which is kind of my own writing. So the this course is, in a certain sense, kind of a follow-on from a course that I did last year. So last year, I did a course called The Critique of Pure Plasticity, and it was called a kind of transducing the analytic. So of which is to say the categories in Kant's first critique. And the way that I gave that course was very much kind of I was kind of giving a seminar on my writing of the book. So the book is almost done now. Um, for those that kind of are Kantians or know kind of Kantian philosophers, the book of Critique of Pure Plasticity obviously kind of follows on in the kind of architectonic sense from Kant. It has an aesthetic, it has a analytic, a dialectic, and a method. So this course is, in essence, a kind of step backwards in a certain sense in the logic, the transcendental logic, although questionably one can ask also whether the kind of Kantian book is in and of itself linear as well. So, but we've kind of gone back in a certain sense to the aesthetic. Um, this is almost written, but it's not completely finished. Strangely, it's the kind of the last thing that I've been writing. Again, I haven't written this book in order. And so a lot of it has kind of new research in, and a lot of that research is based on kind of the more historical development of the notion of field. So as you kind of can understand. So what is a field? What is a manifold? What is the ether? So within the kind of history of natural philosophy, so within the history of what one could call now science, I suppose, but natural philosophy, there has been a kind of very interesting history of kind of coming in and out of this notion, right? So the ether kind of appears, it disappears, gets reformulated into notions of field, gets reformulated into notions of the manifold, comes back again. I mean, even in Einstein himself, in kind of in 1905, in the kind of the very famous year when we get his kind of miraculous year, as they call it, when we get special relativity, the photon, and Brownian motion, all of these famous essays that happen in 1905, we get an essay there that undermines the notion of an ether for light, so the luminiferous ether. So um, just prior to Einstein, we have someone called Lorentz, and which we then get the Lorentz transformations, which are very, very useful for Einstein in special relativity. But Lorentz proposed that there was some ether which light kind of propagated through in a very similar way to the way that sound propagates through air, through a medium. What's interesting in Einstein is that in 1905 we kind of get a set of experiments actually called the Morley experiments, Maury-Michelson experiments that kind of undermine this idea that light has a medium through which it propagates. However, what's very interesting is that then in 1920, Einstein writes a paper called General Relativity and the Ether, which he then kind of reintroduces the notion of the ether and says that space-time, in a certain sense, or space-time manifolds, these field equations that he gives us in about 1916, are then reconsidered then once again in the notion of the ether. So even in Einstein himself, we kind of get this backwards and forwards notion of what the ether is, right? What we will be looking at in particular in the course are, so in these 4 sessions, I won't be doing too much work on, because it's only 4 sessions, too much work on the kind of I could say ancient or classical notions of ether that are there within the kind of pre-Socratics or within kind of classical ancient philosophy. I'll touch a little bit on it today. I'll touch a little bit on Aristotle, tiny little bit on the atomists, but mostly we'll be looking at kind of the 17th century. So today we'll be looking at Descartes. Once I've kind of given the little lecture to begin with, we'll be looking at Descartes, and then we'll be looking at Huygens, so Christian Huygens. So Descartes, much more familiar to everyone. Huygens, maybe, again, I don't know everyone's backgrounds yet. So Christian Huygens, a Dutch scientist or natural philosopher. He's kind of the first person to propose the wave theory of light, right? So that light functions like a wave, right? Not like a particle. Obviously, we then have the history of that development up to kind of quantum mechanics, where in particular in the 19th century, someone called Young, the first kind of the double slit experiment, where we kind of see that light once again seems to function like a wave, and then obviously we have quantum mechanics where we can kind of it's seemingly doing both, right? So we will get up to that. We will get up to some of the quantum mechanics and quantum field theory. Though the concentration that I kind of want to do, again, it's only 4 sessions, will be Descartes, Huygens, Newton. And then that will be today. Then we'll go, although we probably won't get to Newton today, I might start next session with Newton because it gives a kind of nicer ground to then looking at Kant. The third session will be looking at Faraday and Maxwell. So this is 19th century. So in there, particularly electromagnetism, electromagnetism's relationship to light. And in particular there, we get a kind of a resurgence again of the notions of field. So what is this thing that we call a field, right? Lines of force. If we have magnets, and we sort of all did this at school, why do we have those lines that are going from different poles? How do they extend? What do they extend into? And then the last session we'll be looking at, particularly we'll look at Einstein. We'll look at his teacher, his maths teacher, a guy called Minkowski, who was Einstein kind of famously said actually he kind of found all of his lectures really boring, but Minkowski is actually an incredibly interesting writer, so I don't know why he found that, but Minkowski, after Einstein, is the person that kind of really puts together space and time, right? So space and time then become one manifold, one idea, if you will, one notion, one form, which then kind of then grants us this idea of a kind of what Minkowski calls is a light cone. And this cone, and we'll look at this in the last session, it's a kind of cone of causality, and it kind of gives us what is possible in relation to informatic causality. So what light can affect what, right? And so what's at stake in the kind of the whole of this course is, as I said, the kind of the rise and fall of notions of the ether, of the field, of the manifold, through the history of science and philosophy from Descartes really through to Einstein. Now, actually, maybe I'll talk now very briefly about, well, what is at stake then, I suppose, scientifically with this kind of this rise or this ebbs and flows of the notion of a field or the ether. Why does it come in and out of fashion? What is this? What's really going on scientifically behind the scenes? So I would say that the two big, I'd say, scientific problems, if you will, that are going on throughout of this, and we see this also right back in Aristotle, and obviously then within the atomists, which gives us a kind of a clue towards that, is the problem of the plenum and the vacuum, or the void and the plenum, right? So if we suppose a world in which we have atoms, right? Okay, discrete things which are uncuttable, right? As the kind of Thomas kind of means, that these uncuttable, indivisible things, right? And we kind of populate a world, right, in which those atoms are extended, or in this world, they're bodies, they're corpuscular, right? Do we then have to presuppose that in between these atoms, in between these bodies, there is a void, right? Something that doesn't have any material nature to it, that is not non-substantial, that is non-extended, right? If that is the case, then how do these atoms interact with each other, right? How do they exert force between each other, right? On the other, which is called essentially, which is called, the problem then is called action at a distance, right? Action at a distance. And this is, if anyone is, so I've given you obviously the course outline. You should have that sent through. There's obviously the main texts, and then the secondary literature that's given there. You don't obviously have to read that. The one book that I would really, really, really recommend is, I've got it just here because I keep on turning into it. It's called Forces and Fields, and it's called a study of action at a distance in the history of physics by a professor called Mary Hess. Probably the best piece of secondary literature that I've ever read on this, and it really does kind of take you through everything that we're doing. So you can kind of follow the course also along with this book as well. She doesn't quite the same things as I do, but it's a very, very good book. So action at a distance, right? That problem of action at a distance, right? So how do atoms seemingly interact with each other if they're not in contact with each other, right? Gives us then the kind of flip side of what's then known as action by contact, right? Action at a distance or action by contact, right? So the question is, how do things move? How do things interact? How do they have influence on each other, right? So if you have this kind of corpuscular world filled with atoms, and then a void, right? You have to kind of you have to kind of presuppose that there's some means of them interacting. One of the kind of examples, I suppose, that is often to people's minds with relation to this, and obviously, and something that Newton himself actually kind of didn't even like in his own mathematics, or the kind of, we could say, the philosophical or metaphysical presuppositions that his mathematics were producing, is gravity, right? Gravitation. So if we follow Newton, right, his mathematics at least, it seems as though two bodies, right, that are not in contact, that are non-contiguous or non-continuous. So these are the words that will kind of pop up a lot, this notion of things being contiguous, kind of in contact with each other, or continuous, right? Which is to say, not discontinuous or discrete. If seemingly bodies exert gravitational force on each other at a distance, right? How is that possible? The orbits, the planets, the sun, etc. Right? The maths gives us that, right? The maths very much gives us, in Newton at least, it gives us that action at a distance, right? The force of gravity is relative to the masses and distances between bodies within space, right? And as I said again, Newton was not as much a fan of that, even though his maths produced that. And the Newtonians after him were, as is often the case with students of masters, much more, how could one say, dogmatic about it than the others. And there's a kind of the question then of what space is, right, is very important to what we'll be looking at. And there's a distinction between space, the void, matter, extension. And there's people like Clarke, for example, one of the students of followers of Newton, has a very famous debate also with Leibniz about this, about what is space relative? Is space just a container? So, and this is where the kind of the Kant kind of comes in. So in Newton, right, space is understood as an absolute, as a kind of container, right, in which then these bodies are interacting. We won't be looking at Leibniz, but Leibniz has a much more relational notion of space, whereby space kind of is the relation between things, nothing more than that. And then today we'll be looking at Descartes, which is even kind of it's kind of even stranger. Descartes is a lot stranger than people realize, because you have this kind of equivalence between substance, matter, and space and extension. So in Descartes, as we'll see, we kind of get a complete reduction almost to geometry itself, right? Which will also be very, very important for the course. When we ask a basic question, in a sense, what is space then, right? Is space just depth, breadth, and height, right? Is it something physical? Can it have influence? Is it influenced, right? Or is it just inert in a certain sense? Or is it just there, right? It's kind of a background, right? I mean, these problems, I mean, I don't know. Again, I've spoken to everyone. Maybe there's physicists here, of course. I mean, these are still the problems very much that we have today, right? In contemporary physics, you might have heard about the kind of incompatibilities between quantum mechanics and kind of relativity and these things. Can we quantize space, right? Which kind of means that can space be understood as something that is discrete or not in the way that we can do other fields, right? Other kind of particle fields in quantum field theory. We've never found the graviton, right? The graviton is supposed to be precisely this force carrying particle. That's not been found, right? We have no observation of that. So again, still we have this tension, right? And again, before I kind of move into my lecture, because I think kind of this is the kind of just the introduction to what we'll be doing. The question then also, what is an atom? What is a particle, right? Can we distinguish between what we kind of observe as particles or as discrete measurements, as quantities, from the kind of matter or the field in which they then emerge? And certainly now in quantum field theory, right, kind of this notion of I was playing pool last night, and this kind of this comes up a lot in kind of educational kind of literature around how does one teach kind of physics, how does one teach science? This kind of we call it kind of billiard ball notion of particles or of the world, right? Insofar as think atoms are like billiard balls that bang into each other, right? This has completely been displaced to a certain extent by what we now call quantum field theory, where precisely particles are what we call excitations of a field, right? And this kind of last where we are at the moment still with this quantum field theory, this particles are excitations of fields, produces then a kind of one could call it an ontology, or one could call it an epistemology that is very strange, because, and I know kind of we'll get to this very much when we get to Faraday and Maxwell, how one defines a field, usually, or lines of force, right, are by the influence of a particular force that a particle can exert around it. So think about a magnetic field, right? The magnetic field is defined by the presence of a magnet, right? And so the field is produced by that, right? So one could say that the field, to a certain extent, is secondary, or at least that's how it kind of seems, or at least how Faraday and Maxwell thought about it. However, now we've got all the way to quantum field theory. If a particle is an excitation of a field, but a field is defined by the presence of a particle that exerts force within that field, becomes very hard to distinguish what is primary. Is it that the field is primary and then we have the excitation, or is the field just then the propagation of force of that particle? So we have a kind of indecidability and undecidability, if you will, of the primacy, ontological primacy of field and particle. Okay, so that's the kind of you could say kind of bottled history of what we'll be doing. I will be again another short introduction then to what I'm just about to do. As I said, this is part of a book that's called Critique of Pure Plasticity. So the basic question of that book is just to ask through a kind of Kantian framework or a transcendental idealist framework, critical framework, what are the conditions of change? Well, the conditions of the experience of change, conditions of the experience of plasticity, right? And this will get us to a second to when I start sharing. What the way that the critique of pure reason is set out, as I said, with a kind of, it has an introduction, preface, introduction, an aesthetic, an analytic, a dialectic, and a method, is that what the aesthetic does. So why this course is also called a transcendental aesthetic, right? What an aesthetic does, different from, to a certain extent, the way that then aesthetics comes to be understood as kind of similar to philosophy of art or something, right? As we kind of get it in Hegel. What an aesthetic is, or aesthetics are at this particular period of time. So with Kant and prior to this within Baumgarten, who Kant taught almost every single year and taught Baumgarten's Aesthetica, is that what aesthetics kind of is kind of the philosophy of sensation, okay? What can be received. It's and we have this. This is what aesthesis is in Aristotle, right? It's kind of sensation, right? So the philosophy of sensation, the sensibility, the sensible, right? What can be given to the senses, right? What can be given to the senses. If we look then, say, to Kant's third critique, which is called the Critique of the Power of Judgment, which is maybe people have, again, I've not met everyone, so I don't know where they're all coming from. But in that book, we have a discourse, right, or a kind of account of beauty and the sublime, right? And again, this is not, of course, in the third critique, but within those accounts, right, they are said to be aesthetic judgments. Aesthetic judgments. So what then does kind of beauty and sublimity have then to do with a kind of, well, it kind of maybe is kind of obvious, but with the philosophy of sensation, or what's possible for sensation, right? Because not all sensations are sensations of beauty or sublimity. Not all sensations are of art or what we kind of now call aesthetics, right? Now, what that kind of third critique does, and kind of why it folds back into what we're doing, is it kind of talks about the limits of the sensible, the limits of this, right? If you kind of think about what sublimity is, right, or how it's been understood, particularly by Kant. I mean, obviously we have Burke and we have different accounts of this, but what the sublimity is, and what for Kant an aesthetic judgment is a judgment whereby we are provoked from nature, right? We are provoked by something from nature. We try to then, in Kantian terms, subsume it under a concept, but there is no concept, right? There is no concept of beauty, there is no concept of the sublime, right? But fundamentally, what it is he's talking about something that is being given to us that surpasses certain limits, right? And then that's why we have kind of the mathematical sublime, the dynamical sublime in Kant. I mean, beauty is a bit different, but to just kind of, so we understand how aesthetics functions within the first critique within relation to this. So those limits, right, that we get provoked when we look out. I'm in Scotland right now, and and the sea is actually not too rough here, but often it is when the wind is blowing. We see this enormous kind of vastness of the ocean, right? What for Kant is occurring there is that we're reaching those limits of the aesthetic, of what is possible for sensibility to capture, right, and unify. So why is all of this important? So why transcendental aesthetic? What is its relationship to ether, to field? the manifold. Okay, so I'll give you a kind of a description there of this kind of the limits, if you will. Now, the first critique in Kant, in a certain sense, outlines those limits. Right? It gives us an account of what is said to be the limits of sensibility. So anything that is outside of that, right, is then what provokes us. Sorry, I was distracted by the comments. The questions. This is all that was about. Carry on. It was not to say you shouldn't do that, but so Kant thinks what he's has done in the first critique is outlined those limits. Why are those limits to experience, right? So what's also interesting here as well is that if we kind of do this double kind of comparison between the third and the first critique, is that sublimity and beauty for Kant aren't experiences, right? They're feelings. They're not experiences because when that kind of the absolute kind of infinity or kind of the infinite nature of that givenness that we get in sublimity, he says that it does violence to time, right? To space and time. It does violence to it. For Kant, then, experience is something that is fundamentally spatiotemporal, right? It is something within which one can determine something cognitively as something, right? That's what kind of experience kind of is, to a certain extent, for Kant. The question then of the first critique is, well, okay, but then how is it possible, right? How is experience possible? What are its conditions? Like, this is interesting as well. So conditions, not causes. So one might ask, well, what is the difference between a condition and a cause, right? And here we're getting slowly towards to the Transcendental Aesthetic. So when someone makes, we'll do a potted Aristotle here as well. So when someone makes, say, a pot, right? We can ask, well, what causes that pot? What causes it to be that pot, right? And so within Aristotle, we have kind of material causes. We can say, well, the clay. We can kind of have efficient causes. We'll say, well, it's the potter, right? We can have formal causes, so it's the kind of form given to it. And I'm trying to think of all of them. There's four causes. There's the efficient, the material, formal, and the teleological, the purpose, right? So what purpose does this have, right? Okay. And those are the kind of four causes that then one could say kind of give us the pot. Now, within that, what's interesting is that one could say, well, okay, we've got that pot, right? But we've got given us all of those causes, right? Those are kind of the whys. But you've kind of forgotten something as well, right? You've got conditions. So if we didn't have space, right? If we didn't have time, if we didn't have something maybe like causality, right? Or these sorts of, no, let's stick with space and time for a second, right? So space and time doesn't cause the pot, right? It's not that space and time somehow made the pot, right? It's that this is the kind of where this is kind of also with Einstein kind of changes a little bit because we kind of get mutual causes. But anyway, thinking the way that kind of we normally think, the space and time doesn't cause the pot, right? But it is a condition nonetheless. That is to say, without a notion or a form or some kind of idea of space and time, we couldn't have a pot. Right? Nothing would be there in front of us. Right? It doesn't cause it, but it's a condition. Right? So this distinction between causes and conditions is, in a certain sense, right at the heart of the kind of Kantian critical project. Right? The kind of one could even call it this, what often is called the kind of Copernican revolution, right? We're thinking conditions. So, and that's kind of what a transcendental logic is, in distinction to what a general logic is. So, transcendental logic asks, well, what are the conditions? You must have heard it, but many people have heard this before. The conditions of possibility of something, right? Not the causes of it, right? Not the causes. Kant says that's what physics does, right? In a certain sense, that's what physics does, or psychology, or all of these sorts of things, right? But the conditions. Okay. So the search for these conditions of experience is what the critique of pure reason does. Now, my project is a critique of pure plasticity. So I'm looking for the conditions of change, transformation, things that are plastic. Now, in a kind of Kantian sense, I also don't think that we have, and we'll look at this today as well, what's called intellectual intuition. So intellectual intuition, which aligns with what he calls transcendental realism, is essentially the kind of a kind of position which says, to a certain extent, that we have an immediate relation to the world, to actuality, right? So an immediate, let's say non-mediated, right? For Kant, when he's asking what those conditions are, right, and then through the kind of discovery of what those conditions are, he then recognizes or kind of says then that if there are things that condition then experience, that experience is not immediate, right? It's conditioned by something, it's mediated, right? If it is mediated, then all that we can experience, right, is that conditional framework which allows us then to experience. So to give a kind of analogy there, this is a physical analogy, but it kind of works. If we think about different species and what they can see and what they can kind of sense, right? Those, although they're cores, so it's kind of a little bit different, but they are conditioned, if you will, by the differences in their makeup, right? So bees and other such insects can kind of experience, if you will, or sense a spectrum of light that we can't, right? Now, in that sense, they are limited, if you will, or there's a boundary to the extent to which they can experience that is kind of this is causal because we're talking about their biology by the differences, right? And so, in that same respect, this is kind of what Kant's saying, right? So, what we can experience is limited by the conditions of experience. So, this is kind of the same thing that I'm trying to say with the critique of pure plasticity. So, what can change, or the experience of change itself, is conditioned by what allows us to experience change. Essentially, we can't experience any change other than that which we are, in a certain sense, permitted to through the conditions of that change. Right? Now, in the last seminar that I gave last year, I looked at the analytics. So in the first critique, that is quantity, quality, relation, and modality, and I kind of looked through the lens of energy, entropy, information. I didn't manage to do the whole thing because, as you can probably tell, I haven't even started the lecture yet, and it's already 45 minutes. But this, right? So that was looking at the categories. So that was looking at quantity, quality, relation, and modality, which is kind of certain sets of conditions for experience that kind of Kant says, and they are the what Kant calls the conceptual conditions. And this time, I want us to look at the aesthetic conditions, the sensible conditions, right? Okay. And this will all make sense as we kind of go through. So, okay. So that was a kind of introduction, maybe to where I'm going. Let me share my screen, and otherwise I'm not going to start if I keep on just doing this. Okay. 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 So, just going to get a tiny bit of water. Okay. So, I've given a kind of a background to the course, a background to a certain extent, I suppose, to what aesthetics or a transcendental aesthetic is. And the kind of the relevancy of notions of ether, field, and manifold will become gradually more kind of more evident. Okay, so I have to actually push you down here, so otherwise I lose. What about I can do it in a way where I don't lose you, because otherwise I feel kind of strange that I'm losing everyone's face. It's kind of like I'm not. What have I done? No, I've lost everyone's face. Okay, never mind. Okay,
Oh,
so yeah.
I was just gonna say, I think if you go to the view on the Zoom workplace, you can do show participants,
Oh, that would be very useful. Okay,
and
where
maybe that.
that would be
So
good
like
because
click
participants.
on like yeah, you click on the larger screen of Zoom, and then you go to view,
Yeah.
and then show participants. I think maybe that just lists everybody. Sorry, just trying to be helpful.
No, no, no. Thank you very much for being helpful. Good, well done. Okay, so
Mm.
that's not right. Where are we? I stopped sharing 1 second. Yeah. Okay, so now I see everyone again. What did you say? Sorry, I don't even know who that was because I couldn't see the faces. Was it Caitlin?
I
So I could,
think
yeah.
I just I think maybe someone else can weigh in. I don't necessarily know. I just thought that if you hit view,
Is there a
you
way
could
of sharing and
see.
still seeing everyone on the right-hand side?
Maybe the moderator knows.
Yeah, I actually do not know.
Ah,
But I
okay.
think that like you can have like not everyone probably, but you can have like some people on your on the right side of your screen if you uh maybe you can you share your screen now and
Yeah.
then yeah, like on this on your on the right side of your screen you have like four options, right? Like to see people like either like no video at all, yourself, some people, and then um yeah, all as much panelists as you can see on like a tiny part of the screen. Do you see
Show
it on the right
participants or
side?
content there. Oh, wait a minute. Can you see that? Can you still see it? Or you just
Yeah.
see me?
So we can see your screen.
I'm still losing everyone. Anyway, no worries. Let me just get on. Otherwise, I'll figure it out for next time. Um, um, okay. So, um, yeah, so hopefully that gave a kind of bit of a background. So what I'm going to do each time is obviously not give that whole introduction every single time, but um, essentially kind of give a little bit of the book at the beginning, and then the kind of historic stuff. So then the kind of reading of the particular reader, so we kind of also get that as well. Okay, so this is part of this book on the critique of pure plasticity. So the aesthetic, right? So again, I'm not too sure how many people are here from before, or people know that my kind of my method or the way that I kind of work. So I have this. This is taken from Simondon. I try to work what I call kind of transductively, or I kind of try and use the kind of transductive method. That kind of is in obviously the word I first found the word in Simondon. He's not quite as explicit about the way that the way that I use it. Cecile is similar. I've never had a massive conversation with her actually about whether she does kind of think it's exactly the same or not. But anyway, so the way that I like to think about things, or the way that I kind of produce my own work, is I I kind of take a philosophical system, so Kant's architectonics, and I kind of then kind of ask, well, what were the kind of conditions, if you will, the kind of the contextual historical conditions which gave kind of formed it, right? And so as you've seen from the introduction, right? Kant is writing at a particular time where We obviously don't yet have kind of field theory as it's developed in the 19th century. We obviously don't have relativity. We don't have quantum field theory. We don't have quantum mechanics, right? It's developed in the 18th century, right? End of the 18th century. Kant dies in 1804. Kind of broadly Newtonian. But obviously, there are. It's not just Newtonian. We could just say classical mechanics, right? Classical mechanics. We don't yet have the concept of energy, or at least in its kind of modern sense. That doesn't come in until 1807. We certainly don't have a concept of entropy, and we also don't have a concept of information either. We do have concepts of force, however. We have concepts of attraction, repulsion. We have gravitation. We have notions of the atom, etc., etc. We have space and time. We have differing views on what space and time are. Nonetheless, obviously, Kant's book is a product of its time, right? In the same way that all of our writings, to a certain extent, are. Okay, so I kind of look at that and say, well, is it still then adequate, right? Is there a way of transforming that very system through a kind of introduction, if you will, of different concepts that are kind of alien to it or outside to it, if you will? So that's the kind of basic premise, right, of our method. It's kind of an experimental, if you will, to a certain extent. It kind of says, well, how could we reform, if you will, Kant's architectonics if we no longer just think of it through kind of classical mechanics and not just try to argue against it with kind of contemporary science or mathematics and just say, oh, well, this is outdated now because of X, Y, and Z, which we'll look at in a little bit today. But is there a kind of structural, if you will, relational structure to the system itself that will become reformed, right, through the introduction of external systems or external logics of thought, like, for example, field theory? And so that's the kind of gambit, if you will. So the course last year did that through energy, entropy, and information with respect to the analytic, with respect to the categories of quantity, quality, modality, and relationality. And here I'm doing the same thing kind of with Kant's aesthetic, so with notions of space and time, but with the notion of field, or this kind of this field ether manifold idea. I'll talk a little bit about this next week. What gives me license, if you will, kind of what allows me to do that? Is it just a kind of arbitrary choice? I argue that no, from kind of two accounts. Firstly, and we'll look at this next week, the use of field in Kant, Feld, right, is everywhere. It's everywhere and really has not. I mean, no one's ever. It's strange that no one's really kind of written on this. I mean, there's some writing on this particular use in the third critique that we'll look at next week. But what's fascinating in Kant is, I mean, it's metaphorical, it's analogical, right? But Kant has and talks about the field of sensibility, the field of the understanding, the field of experience, the field of the suprasensible. Right? There is the kind of the recourse, if you will, to this this notion, right? This notion of a field in Kant, right? That isn't just exactly metaphorical with respect to what one might understand as a kind of Feld, which just also means in German, as it does obviously field in English, which means a kind of field, which one grows something, right? So it's kind of metaphorical, but it doesn't just mean that, right? It's a kind of some extended space, one might say, right? When one thinks about, well, what would be then the field of possibilities, right? we might think of it as a kind of the field in which things might be able to grow, or the field of sensibility. There's some kind of horizontal spatial notion, right, that is being used. So Kant's appeal to that metaphor itself. The other thing as well is that obviously, because the historic thing I've just given is that the field kind of replaces the notion of the ether in science. Also, and on that point, and this is what we'll be looking at next week, is that Kant himself has his own theories of the ether, right? He has his own theories of a kind of extended material, continuous field, or how manifold. It depends how you want to talk about it. That is the kind of notion of a plenum. And in the Opus Posthume, which is Kant's last work that is published, obviously, after his death, and was supposed to be his kind of major work, where he's really trying to bring everything together, his writings on physics, his writing on knowledge, etc., kind of together, and he calls it kind of the transition from his kind of, I suppose, metaphysics, you could call it, through to physics. In there, we get what are famously called the ether proofs that the ether exists. We get that also in his earlier work called the Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Sciences. And we'll be looking at that. That next week. Because I've gone on a bit, I realize that we won't get to Newton, so I'll do Newton and then those. Because Kant is very much responding to Newton in those two in those two pieces of work. So Kant has a notion of field. He talks explicitly about the field of sensibility, about the field of understanding, and also he has a notion himself of the ether. So then the question for me is then, well, what would be the field of sensibility if one were to think of that field, I suppose, to a certain extent metaphorically, but also then to the development of that as a concept itself, right, all the way up to quantum field theory. Is there anything in that science that then allows us to kind of think about that field of sensibility, which is the transcendental aesthetic, think about intuitions, as Kant calls them, think about space and time as a field, right? And of course, I'm not the only person that's done that. It's precisely what we get in Einstein, right? We get the field equations, we get the manifold of space-time, and again, for those Kantians, we have the manifold of intuitions as well. So there's this kind of uncanny conceptual network going on here. And I suppose it's not just, one could say, well, that's just a kind of coincidence, right? But the point is to work transductively. The point is to try and develop something third, something new, with that within the background. Okay. I think now we've all caught up. So we are at 3. Okay. So bit of writing. And again, as I go through this, I'll stop and talk as well. So, and yeah, once I've done this, the introductions, it was good to know the extent to which people also know about Kant as well. Because anyway, whatever. Okay, so let's start. Transcendentally, right? The purpose of an aesthetic as that which governs the possibility of sensibility and thus possible sensations or intuitions is to distinguish between that which is purely conceptual, right? So a concept pure here means without experience, and that which is simply possible for sensibility. So this notion of what is possible for sensibility is really important, and this is where we'll be kind of going with this, right? What is possible for sensibility? In Kant's aesthetic, right, this signals, above all else, that space and time are transcendental conditions for experience and thus not empirically derived, right? But, so not empirically derived, right? But this does not mean, as kind of Kant famously says, that they are, as a result, just concepts. So this is also interesting. Are space and time concepts, right? Now, kind of intuitively, to say one would just say yes, right? Yeah, well, I have a concept of space, I have a concept of time. But and this is very important for understanding Kant, understanding what transcendental idealism is. What is critical philosophy? Why is critical philosophy not rationalism? Why is it not empiricism? Right? And we'll get into this. Why is it not what Kant calls a transcendental realism? Right? Transcendental realism. But why? And for those who were here again last year, Kant's transcendental idealism is also at the same time an empirical realism, which might seem strange, and Kant says that himself, but that's what it is. It's an empirical realism, right? And in the aesthetic, you kind of start to see why that is, right? Okay, so space and time for a transcendental aesthetic, right? They're conditions for experience, but they're not empirically derived, so they don't come from experience. But this does not mean that they are concepts, right? So if pure, so that is to say they don't come from experience, you don't gain knowledge through them through experience, and a priori, again, that kind of means a similar thing, prior to experience. Why then, right, are space and time not categories or concepts, Begriffe, right, as it is in Kant or in German, which is in Kant, but pure forms, Formen, right? Why are they forms, not concepts? As Kant says, time and space taken together are the pure forms of all sensible intuition, and so are what make a priori synthetic propositions possible. So we'll talk about a little bit about that in a second, right? So space and time are understood as forms. They're not understood as concepts, but nonetheless, they're not empirical. So they're transcendental conditions, right? They're not transcendent, right? So they're not kind of absolute in a certain sense. They're not kind of ideas in a kind of Platonic sense, right? They're forms. They're transcendental, so they underlie experience. They're conditions for experience. They're not experience themselves or experiential, but they're also not conceptual. Okay. So, two answers pertaining to the same critical reason can be given with respect to their formal status. What does formal mean here? Why are they forms? Firstly, so concepts and intuitions perform fundamentally different functions for Kant. So, what is a concept? So, a concept, right? This is either empirical concepts, so we can have concepts that are derived from experience, so like a table, right? The concept of a table doesn't condition the experience. It's a universal, it's a general, right? Under which the plurality of objects may be subsumed. So I have a concept of table. There are many tables, and I can say all of those tables are tables. Right? We can argue about that, of course. It's kind of what philosophy is basically the argument about this problem, especially in analytic philosophy. But nonetheless, we have that notion of a concept being a kind of universal under which, for example, there are two chairs here, right? They nonetheless are a chair. So, or we could talk about causality, which is a pure concept, right, which contains in itself a multiplicity of possible causal relations. So I can say, well, there's causalities out there under one notion of causality. So concepts are thus what Kant calls discursive and mediate, right? They determine what may be thought about an object. So forms of intuition, by contrast, do not subsume a plurality beneath themselves, but contain a plurality within themselves. Okay. So what does that mean? So this gets at the crux, right, of basically what transcendental idealism or empirical realism is. So kind of as the first part, why it's not rationalism, right? So there are not many separate spaces that fall under the concept of space, nor many different times that fall under the concept of time. So what does that mean, right? Essentially, what that means is that Kant, and he says this in the Metaphysical Expositions, right, that there is only one space. And what we call spaces, right, are just parts of that one space. or that one form of space. Same with time, right? I might divide time in certain ways. Say it took me this amount of time to get from here to there. But nonetheless, it's kind of, there's one time, right? It's one form of time. Right? So then it's not conceptual in that respect. One doesn't subsume many times under it. Right? So that's where he's kind of really going with this. This is very important because this notion of one time, one space, or one space time folds all the way back, or comes all the way back into Einstein. Incredibly important for that. Okay. And we'll see, that's the last lecture, we'll see why. And this is also why to a certain extent, I kind of gives me license to still have a distinction between an aesthetic and an analytic. But so there is only one space, in all particular. This is Kant, remember, so I'm not always in agreement with everything here. There's only one space, and all particular spaces are merely limitations or regions within it. Likewise, there is only one time, and all particular times are merely parts of one and the same temporal continuum. Right? So space and time are therefore not concepts precisely because they do not function as universals under which particulars are classified. Rather, they are singular forms within which particulars are given. Right? So within time, like there is, one can distinguish times, if you will. Within space, one can create regions, right, or territories, etc., or limitations and borders. Very different from say a table, right? It's not that there is one table within which then all the other tables are kind of separated or kind of there as regions, right? So there you might be able to see how it's very, very different. Okay. So this distinction reveals one of the fundamental reasons why space and time belong to sensibility rather than the understanding. So concepts, right, make objects thinkable, or cognizable, we could say, or determinable. Intuitions give the objects that are to be thought. So here we start to think about this distinction between what the sensibility is, and wherein intuitions occur, or from the givenness of the world, right? So we sense things, what kind of comes towards us, and then concepts that kind of go out and meet those intuitions halfway. This relationship between prolepsis and alepsis. So a concept may determine the conditions under which an object can be thought, but it cannot provide the object itself, right? Very, very important here. This is why also critical philosophy, also along kind of Cartesian lines, is not just a kind of pure idealism, if you will, kind of like Berkeley. For Kant, or it's not a kind of pure rationalism either. For Kant, it's absolutely necessary that there is a world, right, and that world is actual, right? And he uses this term elsewhere, some form of primordial actuality. There is a world, and that world is giving us, right, intuitions, giving us the material, as Kant calls it, from which we then cognize or think. Right? So it's not that I'm producing that table from out of my mind. There really is something in and of the world that is giving me an intuition, and it's giving me something. The Kant calls the dabile, the given, right? So it's very important. However, space and time, by contrast, are not conditions of thought, right? So they're not conditions of concepts, but conditions of this givenness, right? So this givenness of the world, right? They are the forms through which anything can appear to us at all. So to cut a long story short, if anything isn't in space and time, right, that cannot be given to us through sensibility. So something that is atemporal, spatial, cannot be given to us in experience. So you start to kind of think where we kind of start to understand now why or where kind of this critique is going, and it kind of goes towards God. Or if God is something that is also atemporal and spatial, can they have can have an experience of that. What would it mean if God were to be spatiotemporal? Would he no longer be God? So he starts to see this, what one might call a kind of, as I call it, kind of type of profanity, kind of heresy that's going on here as well. So, but nonetheless, so we have this space and time, they kind of form. So everything that is given to us, there might well be things that are kind of, if you will, outside of that spatial temporal thing, right? But nonetheless, through the conditions of space and time, if those are conditions of sensibility, then I can't have any sensible intuition of it. I can't have any sensation of it. Right? So, however, their priority therefore differs fundamentally from that of the categories, right? So the categories are these pure concepts. Space and time are the pure intuitions, right? Reine Anschauung. The former legislate the understanding, the latter constitute the very possibility of sensibility itself. Okay. So the significance of this distinction, right? So this distinction between space and time being formal, non-conceptual, right? Extends, and as I kind of written here, right, extends beyond this kind of merely technical question of whether space and time, right, are just this concept, or we could argue about this, right, whether they are or not, right, and certainly that is the case post Kant, right. So, but what I think the significance of this is, right, is that it undercuts, and this is what, if anyone wants to kind of read also really good secondary literature on Kant, I mostly align to kind of Allison more than others, so Allison is good. But what this does, right, this kind of distinction between the space and time of forms, not concepts, right, is that it essentially is undercutting or undermining rationalism. Why is that the case? So Allison argues, and here I kind of agree with him, that there are kind of two dogmas of rationalism. Again, it's very difficult to kind of completely reduce rationalism to these historically. Nonetheless, it's useful if you're a Kantian to kind of use it to kind of model what's going on, right? To create that kind of distinction to what's going on. So, two dogmas of rationalism. Why is, in a certain sense, it's a critique of pure reason, and how does that work into critique of pure plasticity, and how does it work into this aesthetic that is trying to look at field ether, etc. Okay. So the first assumption, so the first kind of dogma, is the assumption that truth, right, is ultimately grounded in a standpoint of intellectual intuition, right? Intellectuelle Anschauung, intellectual intuition. So this is famously found in Kant. It distinguishes it from sensible intuition, right? Intellectual intuition, sensible intuition. So what is intellectual intuition? So intellectual intuition, one might say, is a kind of immediate form of intuition, right? It is a kind of divine mode of cognition in which objects are immediately known through thought itself. Thought alone is enough, one might say. And truth is thought of with respect to that immediacy. One has to remove all that which is mediate, all that which is getting in the way of the perspective of the truly revealed notion of God, right? That is what, to a certain extent, intellectual intuition is. I mean, at least at this point, I mean, we can argue what it becomes with people like Schelling and Hegel, etc. But essentially, at this point of time, this is kind of what it's understood at, especially in Kant. It's a divine mode of cognition in which objects are immediately known, right, through thought itself. So the second form of rationalism. So truth is always with respect to that, with respect to God. Second is the assumption that genuine rational truth is therefore analytic, right? Such that the predicate, so one predicate of something, so its quality kind of, is already contained within the concept and can therefore be extracted through analysis, rational analysis alone. So this notion of the predicate being contained in the concept is what we mean by analysis, something that's analytic, or the analyticity of something, is that the predicate is contained in its object. Something is synthetic, it's added on, right? Synthetic, it's added on. So if these assumptions hold true, then the highest form of cognition, right, within this kind of rationalist framework, would consist in the intellect's direct apprehension of being, right, through thought, while finite sensibility would appear merely as a deficient mode of knowledge, right? So anything that is received through the senses then is seen as deficient, right? Because it's mediated, right? It's not rational. It doesn't adhere to analyticity, and therefore it's deficient, right? So it's not kind of we don't get towards truth via that, right? So that's what rationalism wants to do. So again, I'm sure if anyone's here who's studying rationalism, they might disagree with this, but this is certainly from a kind of Kantian position. Okay, then. So if we're kind of going against this rationalist notion, right, this notion that kind of thought alone is enough, truth is how close we get to a divine mode of cognition, that all we need is analysis. All we need to do is try to find the relationship, that kind of exactitude between predicate and subject, or the containment of predicate to subject, all that which is not really in it needs to be removed, right? What happens then? Okay, yeah. What then are we doing with Kant then? Why is that kind of different? Well, firstly, we see that there's a kind of an addition here, or a necessity of the sensible, that which is received. Okay. So, secondly, and for the same reason, at the very heart of Kant's critique lies his break with what he calls transcendental realism, right? So I've just spoken about rationalists, and here we have the other attack, if you will, the other enemy against which Kant is positioning himself in, a transcendental realist, right? And all transcendental realists are those who regard time and space as something given in themselves, independently of our sensibility. The transcendental realist thus interprets our outer appearances, their reality, being taken as granted, as things in themselves, which exist independently of us and of our sensibility, which are therefore outsiders. The phrase outsiders being interpreted in conformity with pure concepts of understanding. It is, in fact, the transcendental realist who afterwards plays the role of empirical idealist, after wrongly supposing that objects of the senses, if they are to be external, must have an existence by themselves and independently of the senses. He finds that, judged from this point of view, all our sensuous representations are inadequate to establish their reality. So what is then transcendental realism? A transcendental realist, and this might be interesting for anyone that you know, it's kind of got on the speculative, did at some point or whatever, is still on the speculative realist train. Is anyone that, in a certain sense, assumes some immediate relationship, whether that be to space and time or to objects in and of themselves, outside of the conditions of their representation, right? To be a transcendental realist, therefore, is to a certain extent to continue to think from the position of God, to continue to have that hubris with which one can say or assert that there is an immediacy to one's either thought or one's experience. Hence, here why also transcendental realists are in and of themselves also empirical idealists, right? Those that have rendered the empirical the one and only means with which truth can be determined. So what is at stake here is really our kind of, I would say it's not necessarily a notion of truth, but it's certainly our notion to where we position our viewpoint with respect to the world, right? Do we say that the world is immediate, that I can gain truth through the immediate relationship to experience? Do I say that I can gain truth through some absolute rational analyticity, right? With which both of them, right, natura sive deus, right, seem to fall back in, right, to each other. That is to say, do we make nature God and God nature and try to think about things only from that position? Okay. So, transcendental realists, being mirror images of empirical idealists, consider space and time to be determinate things themselves. What this means will be outlined in detail in the course, of course. So, Kant's revolution, right, consists in denying precisely this assumption. Space and time are neither empirical properties abstracted from experience, nor conceptual determinations inhering in object independently of experience. They are forms of intuition through which objects may appear to a finite knower. The necessity is therefore transcendental rather than rational or empirical. Space and time for Kant hence belong to the conditions under which things can be given to sensibility. Transcendental realism, so the other side, is therefore not limited to the rationalist tradition alone. Although rationalists and empiricists disagree concerning the source of cognition, whether it lies primarily in reason or experience, they nonetheless share the assumption that objects are given independently of the conditions under which they are cognized. In this respect, both positions remain transcendental realist and adherent to the unmediated, some form of unmediated notion of truth. Okay. So, the critical distinction between Formen and Begriffe is thus inseparable from the distinction between transcendental idealism and transcendental realism. For a space and time were concepts that will belong to the understanding would be predicated of things themselves. It is precisely because they are forms of intuition that they delimit the territory of possible experience while remaining incapable of determining things as they are independently of experience. The Transcendental Aesthetic therefore establishes not merely that space and time are a priori, so prior to experience, but that they are the conditions of possible sensibility, that the conditions of possible sensibility are irreducibly formal. So not conceptual. What does that mean? So my argument, and this is I think this is kind of a given, is that this formality, so that notions, they're not concepts, but they're forms, right? It's that which grants Kant's license, right, to exemplify his profanity through, and here we're kind of starting to see where kind of things might change in the future, through Euclidean geometry or pure mathematics, or more generally, as he says, pure mathematics is a brilliant example of such knowledge, especially as regards space and its relations, as well as the formality under which natural philosophy and the mathematical students of nature, so physicists in that time, regard space and time as containing in themselves all that is real. Right? So it might seem, in a certain sense, kind of, and I certainly felt that this was the case when I first encountered Parents Aesthetic, that what I've been talking to you about for the last kind of hour or so, whatever it is about the fact that the aesthetic is related to sensations, related to senses, right? The world that's coming in, right? The givenness of the world, this primordial actuality, as Kant says in his notes. That might seem to be, on one extent, kind of at odds with the fact that what the aesthetic kind of is dealing with is seemingly things that seem quite abstract, right? Space and time and mathematics, right? This is what's really kind of going on in there, particularly in the aesthetics. It's does the pure forms of space and time, do they ground in a certain sense mathematics, right? Number or arithmetic or geometry, right? They might seem kind of to a certain extent quite kind of separated, right? However, for Kant, and this continues, one might say, from Descartes all the way through to the present day, right? What is fascinating, and this is actually what Hess calls geometrical kind of mathematical geometrics, is this kind of special kind of place for what geometry or how geometry functions in relationship, if you will, in relation to the objects of the outer senses, right? Why this kind of seems firstly like kind of non-intuitive, if you want to use that word, is that one seems that like that mathematics is very abstracted from this notion of sensation. However, here what we're really thinking about is the kind of not necessarily what is given, it's the world that kind of gives us that, right? And it's the world that kind of is, if you will, if we think about it in quantum field theory, in which there are fields, right, which are excited. So it's the world that is energy is moving in, right? But nonetheless, there seems to be these kind of geometric, spatial, temporal, topological, maybe we could call them, kind of notions that seem to be ordering what we are kind of receiving, right? And it's that, I think, that it's important, right? And this, as I said, goes all the way through up to what we have now, is that when we often, and I mean, this is precisely what we get with Minkowski, is that when Minkowski basically kind of shows us what is possible for causality itself, right? So the extent to which light can affect something, or the extent to which an observer at a particular point can act even on that, right? It's the underlying geometry, amazingly, that it seems to be determining that, right? And this is kind of where Kant is getting at, right? But then we have to ask, well, where does that come from? Where does geometry come from? What are the foundations of mathematics? What are the foundations of things like points and lines and angles and all of these things, right? And this is one either says on the one side, okay, well, maybe they're just completely induced through experience, right? Or on the other side, one might say, well, no, there seems to be some kind of capacity for that already, right? That is certainly not inherent to just kind of human finite knowers either. You know, there seems to be some, where is number, right? Where is that? Where are lines? Where are angles, right? I mean, they're in the world, but they're also not, right? This kind of this notion, right, is what comes to be called in I don't know if anyone did take, I don't know whether that's already been done yet, actually, the thing category theory, but it's not category theory I'm about to talk about. This comes to be known after Kant as the intuitionist school of foundations of mathematics by a guy called Boyen in the Netherlands, right? Whereby the foundations, the very notion, of number itself, right, is said to be a capacity or conditioned by the formal capacity for finite knowers here, let's say humans, to intuit space and time, right? So what's fascinating is that, and I'll talk about this in a second, is that this is kind of gets at the heart of the problem, right? And it seems a weird way around it. It's that if you basically align to the idea that geometry or mathematics is something that is just kind of in the world and it is the world, right? You're a transcendental realist, right? If the world is mathematics, that's basically what you're saying. If you're a transcendental idealist, you're saying that no, number is a kind of or mathematics are kind of, or geometry or topology, it's the imagination, right? It's the intuitions, it's capacity to think through notions of space and time, right? Then you're a transcendental realist, a transcendental idealist. And what's fascinating about this is that we can see this problem, right? Going through the history of mathematics. Now, this course won't be, I could have given a course on that side of what I'm doing in the aesthetic as well, but I won't do, because I'm going to concentrate on field ether and manifold. But of course, what's going on alongside all of this as well is this question, right? Where is geometry? What are the origins of geometry? Where is it? Is it purely logical? Therefore, is it purely analytic, right? Is it synthetic? Are we adding concepts? Are we adding forms together in order to then arrive at a conclusion, right? So this is going all the way through, and it is still a kind of very active problem, right? In the foundations of mathematics. Okay, so that was a kind of bit of a side, but it kind of gives us an introduction to what's going on here. So, in a certain sense, right, the critical project encounters a difficulty of its own making with respect to the examples, right, or proposed justifications of the formal a priori synthetic nature of space and time. That is, Kant's Transcendental Aesthetic is supposed to function not merely, right, as a theory of sensibility, what is possible for the sensible, but as a theory of the foundations of mathematics and mathematical science more generally. Now, there are questions of whether he is really doing that, but that's for exegesis. So, Euclidean geometry, right, provided the exemplary case of synthetic a priori cognition, while mechanics supplied the framework within which space and time functioned as the universal conditions of motion, magnitude, and causality. So the Transcendental Aesthetics of Kant is therefore not simply accompanied by 18th century mathematics and physics, it is kind of articulated through them, right? So this is the famous, if you will, kind of attack on Kant's aesthetic, on Kant's philosophy himself, is to say, okay, we have this transcendental aesthetic. You're talking about what is possible for sensibility. You're talking about space and time as those forms. You're saying that then those forms kind of inform all the data that is being given to us, so that all of that data fits into space and time. And then you're saying that kind of that fitting into space and time can then be thought of as also a kind of condition for geometry and arithmetic. So in that sense, you're kind of there's a kind of reciprocal relation between the foundations of mathematics and the foundations of the sensibility through space and time. But the examples that Kant gives, right, this is definitely overstretched, by the way, are Euclidean, right? Well, we don't at least have that kind of real break that we get with Riemann. You have other forms of mathematics or non-Euclidean mathematics prior to Riemann. He's not the only one, but of course it's not until you get kind of Riemann and the kind of the real break with the fifth postulate of the parallel postulate that kind of takes off. But anyway, okay. So if Kant is using Euclid, right? That Euclid's elements, right? That kind of very famous deductive Greek text on geometry. This is absolutely amazing. If anyone ever tried to go through some of the elements, but if that's kind of been displaced, right, or there's an inconsistency going on between Euclidean and other geometries that seem to be just as consistent, so non-Euclidean geometries, whereby this is the famous thing for anyone, whereby in Euclid the fifth postulate is about it's this we kind of get to this, but it's about essentially parallel lines, not crossing over. So in non-Euclidean geometries, where things are curved, we can get that, right? And we can also get things whereby triangles, the angles don't add up to 180. You can see that on a sphere, all sorts of things like that. So does that then undercut the Transcendental Aesthetic if Kant is basically using Euclidean geometry as his kind of example of this, right? So this kind of difficulty of its own making, which is to say via the examples that it used, right, is because it's been historically the case, right? And this is what I've just been saying, that non-Euclidean geometry and non-classical forms of mechanics, right, displaced the very sciences through which Kant justified the transcendental status of space and time. So then it would seem that the transcendental aesthetic must be likewise displaced. So if those are the examples being given, the justification and the justifications of those examples no longer are completely consistent in of themselves, does that mean then we say as I write down here, you throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? Okay. So in the 1940s, and this has kind of remained a problem since kind of Riemann, since kind of people like Reichenbach, Russell, who kind of within analytic philosophy, and within other forms of mathematics as well, within kind of set theory, within logic, the kind of logical basis of set theory, where you say, oh well, you know, has to be thrown away then because because we've shown that there is a kind of analyticity to the mathematics, there's a kind of logic behind it's non-synthetic. Non-Euclidean geometry seems to function, and well, so it seems to be kind of the Kant was wrong, right? Now, Chapman-Jones in the 1940s, it's a really great essay. Kind of, it just says something really simple, right? Just because the examples to which Kant demonstrates the necessity of the forms of intuition, right, cease to be necessary, right, does not mean, logically speaking, that the formal status of the aesthetic itself it shouldn't becomes questionable. I think that's bad writing of mine, but it's thrown away, right? Just because the examples no longer fit doesn't necessarily mean that the structure of the argument, if you will, the system, doesn't necessarily still contain something, right? In a certain sense, it would be, I mean, one could think about this in many respects. For example, I mean, Huygens is a good one here. You know, I'm trying to think of Huygens' use of candles or something. I mean, it would be kind of ridiculous. I mean, it's not quite the same, I suppose. Anyway, if anyone can think of a good example which follows this structure, right, where the examples might have changed, but just because the example changed, it doesn't necessarily mean. The thing I think that's important here is that they are examples, right? That they are not, that the whole of the aesthetic doesn't hinge on the consistency of Euclidean geometry. And I think that's a complete mistake to think that it does. Okay. So what these developments immediately challenge, right, is not the transcendental question itself, right? I mean, we can see that in intuitionist logics, intuitionist mathematics, right? Even if many have taken them to do precisely this, right? But rather the particular manner in which Kant answered that question through the mathematical and physical examples available to him. So the emergence of non-Euclidean geometries, logicist foundations of mathematics, relativity, and quantum field theory, undoubtedly transforms the status of mathematics, space, time, and all that depends upon them. Right? So it undoubtedly does that. And Kant famously appeals to Euclid's proposition 32 as evidence for the synthetic a priori character of geometry. Yet the proposition depends upon the fifth postulate that I was talking about. But I don't think necessarily that means that the transcendental question or that the transcendental structure itself needs to be thrown away. Okay, so let's go to this last bit. So, and then what are we? Okay, so I think that the situation may be interpreted in precisely the opposite direction, right? The mathematical and physical revolutions of the 19th and 20th century do not remove the need for transcendental conditions. I think that they intensify it. And here I align to someone like Ernst Cassirer. So if Euclidean geometry is no longer uniquely privileged, what conditions the possibility of geometry as such? Right? That's just the same transcendental question. Right? If arithmetic can no longer be grounded in the intuition of time, in the manner Kant proposed, what conditions the possibility of mathematical construction in and of itself, right? We still have that problem, right? How is mathematics possible? How is science possible? Those are the two questions that Kant asks right at the very beginning of the first critique. How is science possible? How is maths possible, right? If space and time are no longer absolute forms, so this will be the relativity set, but variable structures articulated through relativistic space-time, what underlies their transformation? So the transcendental problem not only remains for me, but it becomes more pressing. So the task, right, undertaken, this is within the book, and we will be looking at this, right, is consequently neither defense or the refutation of Kant. I think that's one shouldn't. That's not philosophy. Right? That's something else. It is instead a transduction of the transcendental aesthetic through the mathematical and physical revolutions that succeeded it. Right? So the question is no longer whether space and time are transcendental forms, but whether they themselves presuppose a deeper transcendental condition. So if the forms, this is where we kind of come in. If the forms of intuition, right, are neither eternal or immutable, but susceptible to transformation alongside the sciences through which they are articulated, then the task becomes one of determining that which makes such transformations possible. So the wager, right, of the aesthetic is that this condition, right, so the condition of space and time themselves as forms, right, is field, right? So, and this notion of field is what I call the agros of thought. So agros, going back to the Greek, as us philosophers are wont to do, the agros of thought. So that they're in the aesthetic, right? Space and time are forms, but they're seemingly conditioned by some other more fundamental form itself. And that, I argue, is this notion of field itself. So why was Kant using the field of sensibility? Why was Kant talking about the field of the understanding? Why do we keep on returning to this notion of the ether, to this notion of field, to this notion of the manifold? Why is it we keep on returning to this? I mean, its geometries to a certain extent change, right? Minkowski is using Euclidean geometries, but nonetheless, he still has this recourse to this notion, this unifying notion of some form of manifold in which space and time can be thought together, right? This is where I kind of come in, right? So this kind of togetherness of space and time. And of course, we have this famously now, Minkowski, gentlemen, you know, space and time as separate things are no longer mere shadows, they must be thought together. And this certainly, from all observations, seems to be the case. So no longer this kind of a space and time as kind of these kind of separated forms, as Kant proposed, but as themselves conditioned by this notion of field. So, okay, so that then, if you will, if one is to do that, right, if one is to transduce, if you will, Kant's aesthetic and kind of make an argument that there is some sort of underlying, more fundamental notion, not notion, let's call it a form, let's call it what it is, that kind of underlies space and time, that is field, right, the agros of thought, then one has to return to the history of that notion, right? And this is precisely what I've done, and what we will be doing. Okay, so I'm just doing that. So what? It's two. Is it 2.5 hours? I just want to check because I'm now about to start this historic stuff, and I want to see how much time I've got left at this point.
Yeah, we have time till 11:30.
Exactly. So about 45 minutes, right?
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. Okay. How many people are there? Only 24. Okay. Right. Okay. Well, I'm going to go get some water very quickly, and then I'll just carry on. Maybe we've got 45 minutes. It'd be good for you to get some of this stuff because this is kind of why you've come here for, not just for the book, but some of this stuff as well. So,
Then
and
maybe
then
we could have
yep,
now like a 5-minute pause also for
very good
mental
idea.
cognition. Yeah.
Very, very good idea. I think it's a very good idea. Absolutely. And I think we should do that each week as well. It's always good to do that. Yeah, absolutely. And if you take longer, you take longer. Absolutely no worries. Okay, great. I'll see everyone in 5 minutes. We could do it, but yeah, as I said, if you need longer, you need longer. Whatever. Okay.
Joel, also when people come back, there were
Some
three
questions.
questions in
Yeah.
the chat, but I don't know if you want to like answer them now
Yeah,
or
yeah, I
maybe
will
at
do.
the
I will
end.
do I will do very quickly. That's a good idea, I think. It's a good point as well, actually. I think that it's a good time to do it next week as well. Yeah. Wonder whether anyone's watching the World Cup at the moment. I'm in Scotland, so it was certainly a very busy time last night in Scotland.
The Scottish people like a lot football, I guess.
They do, yeah, and it's 28 years since they have been in the World Cup. What I think find very strange as well is, well, not strange, but like I was walking through town last night, and Dundee's not a very touristic town at all where I am. Like no tourists come here, but there was loads of bagpipes, and I was like, wow, they're like doing it for themselves. It was quite funny. I quite liked it. Yeah.
Well, I really don't like football, so I'm really happy that Chile is not go was not going
Oh,
to
right,
the
okay,
World
fair
Cup.
enough. Yeah. No,
I don't I don't have to deal
no,
with the
absolutely. Yeah.
chaos.
I don't know if I'm a big fan of football. I quite like this beginning bit of the World Cup when you get to see like I don't know, Bosnia and like other teams that you don't really know. Like I don't know, I quite like that bit, but not football in itself. I'm not a big follower.
Well, I don't know if people are there already. Well, I know we three are. Hi, Niam. Um, but maybe we can wait 2 minutes or something.
Yeah, yeah. What I'll start just talking about. I don't know whether they're here or not, but I'll just maybe start asking some of
Yeah,
the
people are coming back now.
cool. I'll start answering some of these questions or kind of looking through them. So, uh, Sebastian, next week I think we'll do the introductions properly at the beginning, and that way then I can get to know who these people are and stuff. So, I can't see your surname.
You should, because
Yep.
you've mentioned a few times that it would be important for you for people to introduce themselves. So maybe well,
Yep.
let's check the time. But since you mentioned that it was important for you in order to know how much people
Yeah,
know
it would
about
be just because I don't, yeah, exactly. Because I don't know. I mean, it's one of the, because so many people come from all different places in the news center. It's sometimes difficult to determine, whether you're pitching it to, I know lots of people here are doing the critical philosophy course, so I know that there's that element, but of course, it's assumed knowledge sometimes is not always the best. But yeah, that would be good just to, at some
Yeah,
point.
so maybe, well, I don't know how long is what you want to present now, but then do you think that we are like within time reach?
We could do. I tell you what would people prefer? Otherwise, because I've been speaking for quite some time. Why don't I could just do this always happens. Things get pushed on a little bit, but that's absolutely fine. Why don't we could present ourselves now, and then yeah, let's do that. Stop me speaking for about Descartes for another 45 minutes, and then I'll do that next week.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, good idea. Well done.
Yeah,
Topic.
then
Yeah.
yeah, Alina was just wrote, yeah, you can do introductions, but you have to stop the recording. Yeah, I'm sorry, maybe the meta moderator can tell me. Like, I don't know if I have to stop the recording or if you have to stop the recording for this. I mean, pause it, not stop it. Um, maybe
Do I have to
tell
do it?
me in the
No.
chat.
Can I do it?
No, no, no. I was
Oh,
talking to the meta
all right.
moderator.
Okay.
Like either me or um it's my first time moderating, so I actually don't know about it. But
That's all right. Um, and I kind of always forget how these things work as well. Um,
well, I'm not hearing, so I'm just gonna pause it myself.
okay. Okay, so some of these questions. So, if you don't mind, Sebastian, I might move on to I know that you had some others, but I might move on to some of the others, if there are others. So, is a condition on? I think that was on. Is a condition ontological or epistemological, um, or both? Well, I suppose. that's a very difficult question because it kind of as these things are, it depends on what one means by ontology. But for Kant at least, I go down the line that it is an epistemological condition. So it's a condition of what can be known more than what is, I suppose. The reason why I kind of hesitated on that is because ontology, as maybe those who've read Heidegger on, someone's reading that Heidegger on Kant, there is a whole question of what it can be understood by ontology within Kant himself, particularly within the kind of rationalist tradition prior to Kant, with people like Wolff, Baumgarten. Ontology is kind of the science of what is possible. And strangely, theology is the science of what is actual. So if Kant is to a certain extent thinking about what the conditions of possibility are, and if you're looking at what those possibles are, in a certain sense, they're kind of ontological, but they're ontological with respect to what that means in the history of what ontology meant for those. What it sometimes distinguished between what's called metaphysica generalis and metaphysica specialis. So metaphysica generalis, or general metaphysics, was understood as ontology, which would be the philosophy of possibles, and then the special metaphysics would be of psychology, theology, and cosmology, which would be then applied, if you think it can see it in that respect, to what is actual, because God is taken to be actual, and so is the soul, and so is the world. Then you have that distinction. But I would say that a condition for Kant is more understood in what we would now call the epistemological sense, insofar as Kant kind of displaces that tradition, or at least moves us away from that tradition. So yeah, that's how I would answer that one. What's it? I think that's again from Arnab. Is the Transcendental Aesthetic substantiated by 18th century mathematics and physics, or are the later mapped as axiomatic models on the former? Is that for me, or is that for those sciences in themselves? Maybe I can answer for both. So 18th century, is the Transcendental Aesthetic substantiated by 18th century? Oh, I see, 18th century. Okay, yeah, okay, interesting. So that gets to the heart of it. So are they modeled on either? I mean, I would argue that to a certain extent, what Kant is doing is modeling his critical philosophy in a certain sense through classical mechanics. So in that sense, there's a kind of reciprocal relation between the two. Kant's early work in his first ever book is on the notion of force, and the notion of where he's talking about Descartes' notion of force and Leibniz, and so it's very much in physics. And so a lot of it comes out of Kant's engagement, explicit kind of engagement with the maths, and mostly he's much more of a engaged with natural philosophy than he is with the mathematics of that particular time. So it's not necessarily kind of mapped. But one thing that's very interesting, actually, and this is in terms of what the axioms, right? So in Kant, he argues that science at that particular point has given us a set of principles, and those include inertia, they include the reciprocal relationship between forces, and the permanence of matter itself. And he says those are, if you will, they're kind of not quite axioms, but they're principles in that sense. They're kind of axiomatic. And so those are the things that he then kind of transforms, if you will, transduces into his own kind of set of principles that then you get later in First Critique. So it is very interesting. There is a kind of, it's a kind of mirror almost of one another. So the kind of physics grounds Kant's questions or grounds the transcendental, and transcendental grounds the physics. So you get that kind of reciprocal relation between the two.
If we can just add a thing
Yep.
to that, those two questions are really good, Arnav. Sorry, one operational question though. Do you want us to like interrupt during the lecture and ask questions or on the chat or
I
how
would
would we
just put
expect
your.
it to
I
happen?
would say just put your hand up. If they're finished, just put the hand up, and then I'll just interrupt's fine. Like Neve, for example, was just was
Yeah,
kind of
cool. So just to turn around these questions, these two questions, is it like these preconditions Kant is talking about out in nature, so like time and space is out there, or is something that is on our heads, like I mean on our intellectual capacity to model nature. Those are the actions, right? Axioms are observations of nature that you cannot prove. So they are, there's a fancy word for that, but I forgot. But yeah, it's something that you observe and then you use to formalize to create an schema of thinking. So I'm wondering, like, are these preconditions, Kant and the ones you've been talking about, out there, independent of, thinking brains, or they're like embedded within our thinking system?
Mhm. It's a very important question about where are these conditions, and there are several answers to that question. Um, the if a very very good book on this is also Catherine Malabou's book on the epigenesis of reason. About how is it that we have this transcendental capacity? Where does it come from, right? Does it evolve, right? In that sense, then is it biological? Um, um, Kant kind of seems to suggest such a thing. There's many reasons why one could say that. Um, the question about whether they're innate or not steps us into another realm of kind of what their status is. Certainly, the capacity, if you will, for experience as Kant sees it, which includes then what we're looking at this time, the aesthetics of space and time, and then the categories, which is like quantity, quality, relation, and modality, and all of the other ones in there. Certainly, those are although they're, I think that the anthropocentric kind of critique of Kant is absolutely correct, although Kant does also say that absolutely other animals are capable of experience as well. Interestingly enough, as well, Kant argued that aliens existed and that if aliens didn't exist with rationality and the capacity for experience, that they could. So that's one way of saying that they are potentially developed and therefore they're kind of biological capacities, what one would need to have experience spatiotemporally. The reason why one has to kind of be a little bit cautious with that is because, and I kind of come down more on this side, is that what Kant calls this kind of this whole project is what's called a transcendental logic. So, in distinction then from, for example, a general logic. So a general logic would be based on the principle of non-contradiction. So it basically asks whether there is a contradiction within the terms, basically, and therefore you get the answer through that contradiction, through the kind of the logical laws of thought, as they're outlined by Aristotle and Ball and others. Transcendental logic essentially is just asking that question. Well, not what is logically kind of the cause, but as I said, but what is the condition? So, in that sense, it's kind of outlining a logic that one doesn't have to necessarily that space and time are in the head or in the mind. It's kind of just saying that they are those conditions with which we need what experience cannot be thought. So that's the kind of maybe the way out of it. It's a kind of like it's a project of logic in that sense, and hence why one can say whether or not Kant is offering a philosophy of mind or not. Certainly, there's elements to suggest that he absolutely is, right, that this is a question of consciousness, etc. But then there's bits in it where it seems to kind of put it into a different realm. So, for example, the same thing would then be saying, well, where is the principle of non-contradiction, right? That same answer would be, well, is it in the brain? Kind of is, but it's also a logical principle. So again, we're not quite sure. So that would be my kind of answer to that one. Yeah. Yes.
Well, interesting. Yeah, it lifts the rigidity of a mathematical framework because
Huh?
very like if I understand well, the transcendentalist logic approach is lifting the very structured approach that you would use with
Mhm.
some mathematical formalism, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
And in that sense, allowing you to ask like grander questions, questions about experience and beauty and whatever.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Absolutely. Yeah. I think thinking it through mathematics is a good way of thinking about it. And the question of where is mathematics, that's it's a difficult question to answer. Okay, Neve, I think you've got your hand up. Hi.
Hi, yeah, thanks. Some of what I think I'm trying to get at has been, asked there, particularly by Sebastian. Um, but I was just kind of wondering about, if you could say a little bit more about synthesis, itself, and Euclidean geometry as an example or an exemplary case of synthetic a priori cognition. Could we kind of say that the Euclidean geometry is a kind of model of an instance, that it's the best model of what we're already doing in representation, and that's why it's adequate. And that also this opens it up to the revision of the concept of the model, So even though space and time are pure forms, it's still highly conceptual, in terms of how we adjudicate them or how we judge them and how we advance and develop them. And then I guess the other thing I'm curious about is, I mentioned briefly about, part-whole relations, in terms of, theory of synthesis in Kant and the unity of apperception, which is to do with the sense and the possibility of sense, that perception, and then the unity of mathematical concepts. So there's something about that whole kind of framework that is about the unity and the wholeness and the invariance of that, even though it's subject to revision in terms of concepts. So that's a kind of quite a top-down sort of model of thinking, and that there is going to be a whole. Of course, there's an aesthetic then of what is outside that, and a question of what is lying outside it. Whereas, let's say, Leibniz, his form of synthesis is much more bottom up. It's about, and it introduces the whole question of scale. So he's not sort of saying how do parts conform or not conform to a whole that we already have an existing concept of a priori, but instead, if we start to put parts together and they have different relations, suddenly we realize there are smaller scale relations between parts, and that actually that collapses our sort of model, and we have to revise our concept in that way. So it's a kind of a bottom up, but actually there's an idea of what's outside it that you maybe are talking about in terms of the field in Kant, but actually it's sort of more imminent in the method, and it's in a bottom up sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm trying to think which way I should go. I'll go backwards. What was the first one again? It was on I forgot.
Model and the representation of the model, and the adequation of it, and it's governed by a concept, and its revision.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so the Euclidean, that was also in terms of synthesis, right? So the example that's given is the holding together of points and the relationship that points have to lines. So the notion that the way that kind of Euclid comes into the first into the aesthetic within that first part of Kant's first critique is about this. It's about the kind of that one experiences a line, or one thinks, even imagines a line. Actually, it's about imagination as well here. So don't even have to go to experience it, because mathematics, again, this kind of answers it, is the science of concept construction for Kant and manipulation. So when you're doing geometry or arithmetics or whatever form of mathematics it would be, it's kind of an abstract construction of basically of worlds, in a sense, in the head through concepts, whether those concepts be angles, whether those concepts be derived from others, etc. But for him, obviously, at the basis there is space and time as the forms that are not conceptual but allow for that. right? They allow for that concept construction. If you will, within a kind of what one might think of as one step even further abstracted from a coordinate space or some form of, if one thinks about the way that kind of geometry functions, whether it's Cartesian, polar, or whatever, the way that in a certain sense one has to kind of presuppose some given. This is the thing that's difficult, and we might find this as we go along, is that whether we reduce field just to spatial terms, that's the thing I have very difficulty kind of sometimes speaking about, because it's almost prior to the fact that there's space. This is the way that it's almost like a kind of a given. If anyone knows their maths, it's what one would call a topos or a generalized space, right? It's almost it's that space within which spaces are then possible, right? And so that's kind of where I think that he's kind of coming at it from, and hence, therefore, Euclidean, and the kind of answers would be to say, well, Euclidean is then just one possible geometrical structure that is within then the larger notion, which would be this generalized topos, which then gets us closer to something like
a species of a genus kind of idea.
Absolutely, yeah, exactly,
yeah.
I think it's connecting to some of the discussions happening in the chat. Like I like we use the word field quite loosely, like research field or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if you lift the meaning of field, or what is it like? And then the interesting question, sorry, the interesting turn here, as you mentioned, Joel, is that you're going from space as a three-dimensional flat coordinate space in Euclidean geometry into a field. But again, to be able to formalize a field, you need space and time as a precondition. So you're kind of lifting everything one layer above, and then you have time and space, and then you have the thing that threads all the points in time and space together and connects through transformations. I think that's what makes a field that brings that connection.
Absolutely.
But if you leave that, like, it's how, for example, if you're thinking about different fields of thought, what are the threads or connections, transformations that connect them together, which is very aligned with the transductive kind of thinking you're doing.
So, I mean, and this is interesting. This actually kind of refers then back to the last of Niamh's question, actually, in terms of the question of how synthesis functions, either differently within Leibniz or within Kant, which would be the question. I think someone's spoken about systems. But the question then of the systematicity of it. How does the system hold itself together? What is the relations between wholes and parts within that? So I take a kind of view also with the reading of Kant, but it's also highly influenced by my own readings of Leibniz, and in particular, translator of Michel Serres' thesis on Leibniz. So that's my way in. And there is what one kind of Serres privileges what one could call the kind of the non-privileged starting point within a system. So, and we didn't do Descartes today, but one can see when we will do it like next week, it's very important, is that the deductive linearity of Descartes' reasoning, right? It's because the supposition of first principles from which then everything kind of follows. What's interesting is that, and I think this is kind of where Niamh's kind of going, in Leibniz, you don't necessarily quite get that same form of systematicity. You do get principles, of course, you get principles of sufficient reason, indiscernibility, etc. But his construction of a system is, as Niamh called it, more bottom up. And so in a certain sense, it's through comparing relations between models that invariance then
testing, like it's a kind of testing and a generative. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Now, I actually take a kind of similar view to the way, well, that's the way that I do philosophy, but also to the way that I think the Kant system is also can function. So as I said, is that you have this, the first critique kind of goes preface, introduction, aesthetic, the understanding, dialectic, method. It's funny that the method is the end as well, but so you can read this linearly, right? You could say, and the way that you would read it linearly or rectilinearly would be something like, okay, well, you start in the aesthetic. The aesthetic is where sense comes in, right? So we start with sense coming in, and then you have the analytic, which is the understanding, and then the concept joins it. And then you have the dialectic wherein Kant starts to talk about ideas. So these are the big totalizing ideas like God, the soul, and the world. And then you get the method. And then at the end of the method, he talks about the one idea, which is unity itself. So you could think of it, which actually kind of seems like bottom up, actually. But you could think of it as like a linear. Now, I don't think that it really functions like that. I think that it functions much more like a kind of Leibniz. It's not really, you're not really sure where you should start, really. Do you start with the question of unity? Kant kind of seems to say that you need to. That's what a system is in architectonics. Do you start with unity? Do you start with the fact that the world is there? Do you start from the fact that experience is obviously possible because we have actual experiences? Do you start from, I think that, and this goes back to the kind of Sebastian's point, is the relationality between these fields. So Kant, and I'll talk about this next week, talks about these different sections, right, as fields, different fields. So he says there's the field of sensibility, the field of the understanding, wherein there are concepts. There's the field of the suprasensible, wherein there are these ideas, God, the world, and so on. And the question then is, well, how do these fields, and I think this is in one of the questions here, I think, is about this kind of multiplicity of fields, right? Are they all fields? Would it be to say that they are all fields, right? So there's this kind of multiplicity of different types of fields. Here, actually, what will show this a little bit next week is that and I think lots of people are doing this, so maybe it's just kind of in the kind of à la mode, as we say in fashionable, but the way that one does it within mathematics is through something like category theory, right? So that is to say that the schematism, right? So that which Kant uses is the way that things bridge in the first critique. The schematism is essentially a mapping of morphisms. So it's essentially a way of seeing connections between sets of relations, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so each field with it, and it's no kind of surprise also that category theory, and not just category theory, but topos theory and other forms of, one could say, algebraic topology, for example, have been incredibly important mathematically for quantum field theory, right? It just happens that there is also, it's not just happens, there is a kind of mutual development of this way of thinking. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting about that as well is that if you look at something like quantum field theory, right, there are the kind of multiplicity of different types of fields, but they interact, they conjoin, they couple, right? They couple. And the importance of something like category theory is to think about the way that those couplings across fields then occur, right? So that would be the way that I would kind of respond to that, Niamh, is that I'm maybe more Leibnizian than Kantian in that respect in terms of the way so synthesis then would be quite similar to that. It would be this kind of some emergence of relations, invariance to relations. Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you, Joe. That was great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I guess we're ready. Oh, there is another question. Maybe that could be the last question if everyone is fine with it. I mean, where time passed, I could also like give the host thing to someone else if you want to stay. I don't know.
Let's have one more question and then we'll have a good start next week. Maybe people can always send me questions.
Yeah, sorry. I'm trying to make sense of this with a limited knowledge of the math and the physics. And but I'm interested. I mean, it sounds like a lot of this is, Kant is suturing together space and time. It sounds like in this I guess as forms of intuition. And this leads us, it seems like you're saying, to Einstein. And then I guess I was trying to make sense, there's been, as I understand it, there's been some kind of revival of Leibniz, like in the loop quantum gravity world, like these people like Lee Smolin who are like trying to say that there's some kind of decoupling of space and time, and that like time is more primal to this kind of, and then there's this like configuration space that evolves out of that. I guess, I don't know, is this kind of schematism of like there's this coming together of space and time, and then there's a decoupling that's happening does this map onto the trajectory that you're?
Absolutely, yeah, it's interesting, Josh. Yeah, so I won't be talking about quantum gravity or Smolin or Ravelli or those people, but absolutely, it's yeah. I actually teach a course also on that as well for my other job. So yeah, absolutely, Smolin and this. I mean, and as you say, it's a revival, very much so, of a kind of Leibnizian notion that space kind of emerges as a set of relations between things. Um, It's not that I would definitely wouldn't say that I'm kind of pushing against that at all. In a certain sense, I suppose the way that I work as well is kind of more, is to see, well, what can we do with Kant from a kind of different perspective as well. So I've taken it much more down the route of kind of quantum field theory and relativity. Again, one of the reasons why I tend to lean on certain sciences more than others is more to do with their capacity for observation. So I don't work very much on string theory for that very reason. Beautiful mathematically, but very difficult, almost impossible to produce any experimentalist proof for. Quantum loop quantum gravity is something fairly similar as well. I think it's a beautiful mathematical model. I have a huge respect for Ravelli but yeah, at the moment there's not much experimental kind of observation with relationship to that. So that's where I would also go with that.
It wasn't so much
Yeah.
about like trying to get like what is like, you know, the right answer or what you think is.
Yeah.
But
Well,
just this
in a way,
question about the schematization of
Yeah,
space-time
absolutely.
and
Yeah.
and the trajectory of that through thought. And I
Yeah.
was trying to like simplify it a
You know,
little.
it's actually very quickly just on that, very interestingly enough, actually. So on that, absolutely. I mean, you must have heard of the idea, like I was talking a bit about the graviton, right, earlier. So like the fact that space-time can't be quantized. I mean, this goes around in popular people say, oh, we can't quantize space-time. So this is the problem, right? That Ravelli and quantum gravity are trying to solve string theory, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, we also, interestingly enough, just on this, we also have, and we'll get to this by the end, is what does it mean then to have field equations that account for space and time together, and then another set of fields, which are the particle fields from quantum field theory. What does it mean then to have those kind of together but not separated, right? One kind of on top of almost the other. What's interesting about that is just the kind of is that Einstein himself, his famous last attempt is an attempt at a unified field theory. So Einstein really didn't like this, that there seemed to be a multiplicity of different fields. He wanted to try and unify this through some form of unified field theory, which he never managed to do, and we still don't have, right? So yeah, it's that's just the kind of response, I suppose, to kind of what the problems are going on in here. You know, it's like yeah. Anyway, yeah.
I think I can
Thanks.
wait shortly. Sorry, I my interventions, but I can put some physics dimension to that. But it's interesting, Joel, that you mentioned category theory before, and now we're into look quantum gravity. Like we're going far away,
Yeah.
but like a common thread and one big underlying question. And the common thread is we had particles. We were thinking of matter. Quantization is quanta, like discrete things. But now we're turning that around and thinking about relations. That's why category theory comes as a handy tool. You're thinking about how things transform into each other. But the big question now is time and space something that appears or arises from these relations, or you need it, like it's something that you need to have before they appear? So it's something that, is emerging, or is something that is there a priori, which is exactly a
Yeah.
question Joel started this session with.
Absolutely. I mean that it's uh it's a fucking difficult question. I mean that's the question. I mean yeah, exactly, yeah. I mean physics hasn't told us the answer yet. So I mean it is just the thing, and I will see kind of where I'm trying to go with this as well, right? And yeah, it's interesting this, right? Okay, there's relationality, discretion, etc. I mean, what's interesting to a certain extent is that kind of phenomenologically, we already have, and we'll look at this later, we'll look at this in Descartes as well. Phenomenologically, we already have discrete notions of space and time. We already have position, right? And so the question also then is what happens to the notion of position, right? Let's just say coordinates, X's and Y's and stuff, when space and time become melted together, which we get with general relativity. And then the question then also becomes about absolute about relationality. So we'll get to this for the very end, is that this is the Minkowski kind of question as well, is that if absolutely technically, right, every observer frame, so everyone is observing the world, has their own what's called proper time in Minkowski's relationship notion, right? This is the question of that. Then I was to go really, really fast somewhere else and come back, right, to that. And then there's time dilation. We'll do a whole week on this. Time dilation and time contraction, right? The question is, the only way that we know that there has been time dilation or time contraction, which is the observation of special relativity, is if we compare two different world lines, two different proper times, right? And then geometrically say that they occurred within the same space-time, right? But it's only the geometry and the mathematics that actually gives us to that. And it's only once we come back and compare, so the relationality, that actually then kind of gives us what is supposed to be this homogeneous, continuous manifold that is space-time. So it's also really weird, even from that perspective, is that relationality is still fundamentally there even in kind of non quantized versions, if you will, of space and time. So anyway, that was a kind of a response to that. But that's the whole fourth week on relativity. Okay, I think maybe we can have a bit of a break. Not a break for a week. I will see you next week. Thank you very much for everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Send me
Thank you.
questions, no worries, and see you next week. Cheers, Josh. Cheers, everyone. Cheers, Sebastian. Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.